just been really gung-ho for him to sign the Emancipation, or any that may have talked behind his back, or each of the pages deal with like each of the cabinet members. So is there one cabinet member in particular that you have an interest in that you'd like to talk about?
I think there's probably at least 2, if not 3, that sort of stand out in my mind, and not necessarily in regard to the Emancipation Proclamation, but I think in their being appointed to the cabinet to begin with. So in my way of thinking, Lincoln did appoint a team of rivals. Not only were some of them rivals, amongst each other, but they were.
The bells are going off again.
Oh yeah.
It's too hot.
I brought 2 books, and this is going to be interesting. This is today's modern team of rivals. And if you look at the back, at least 3 of the 4 here are the ones that stand out in my mind as rivals, basically against Lincoln for one reason or another, and that's Seward, Chase, and Stanton. And then here is the book written by Francis B. Carpenter, and this was printed in, and this is the second edition, 1867. So the first edition was probably 65 or 66. We're getting to the very beginning of, how can I put it, behind the scenes. I'm going to tell you what happens in the White House behind the scenes. I'm going to write about Lincoln. I'm going to find out as much as I can. I'll tell you my experience having been in the White House, painting the big painting of the Emancipation Proclamation, getting to see and not only study Lincoln and to see him and look at him in various attitudes while he was sitting and writing or standing or talking or working with somebody else, but each one of the members of the cabinet. And so Francis Carpenter had a very unique moment in history, and he knew it, and he came out with this book. Well, back when this came out, it would be like, in a way, almost printing something in, what are the things, when you cash out of the store and you see all these Tadler papers. Well, this would have been sort of like a Tadler book because it was new, it was scintillating for someone to be talking about things that the public knew nothing about. And this man's got this, firsthand story. Well, not only does he write about what he sees during the painting of the Emancipation Proclamation and while living 6 months in the White House to do that, but he also talks to other people, just people who might have casually met the president or for one reason or another come across him during his time in Washington or knew him during the time that he was running for the presidency and what he was like when he lived in Springfield. And some of the things that are in here are so interesting and so humorous. And one of the things that always got me is there's a story about, an Englishman. And Carpenter has found this from someone else who met this Englishman, and was talking to this Englishman and said, oh yes, well of course, before the president was elected, he used to go out in the morning, and he would take a basket oftentimes and go down, to the shops in Springfield and would do shopping. He'd be shopping for Mary Lincoln, for his wife, and bringing things home. And oftentimes he would go and buy his own steak for dinner. And the Englishman couldn't imagine someone who had become president going out to buy his own steak. So the times were different, life was different. Things that we think of as being, very, very out there in the public all the time weren't. And so by word of mouth, Carpenter also puts these other odd little stories about Lincoln inside this book. So to read through it is like crawling back in time and not only getting Carpenter's view of things, but getting the view of other people that he talked to about this man. And we look at Lincoln today and know what a huge figure he is in our history, certainly, but also in world history. He's just a huge, enormous figure. And when we're asked, what president is who's the greatest president? Usually Lincoln comes out at the top of the list, and that means oftentimes before the man he most admired, and that was George Washington. So Washington was Lincoln's ideal, and Lincoln has become our ideal, and Lincoln would be humbled by that. I think he'd be, awestruck. His remark would be very much like our latest man who just won the Congressional Medal of Honor. I just did my job. That's all I did. I did my job to the best of my ability. Well, the best of his ability was more than what people reckoned with. They saw what Lincoln seemed to be like. A man who was sort of backwoodsy because he'd been born in the backwoods of Kentucky, and that some of that never left him. His phrasing, the way that he spoke, and the way that he walked, because he was such a large man for his time period. People were awed by his size. And it didn't mean that he was graceful. If you're 6'4" and you're long of limb, in other words, his torso was short in proportion to his limbs, you don't look very gainly. You look awkward at times. And so he seemed to shuffle on top of everything else. People didn't take him for what he was, and finally, as smart as he was, as intelligent as he was, probably a genius if he'd ever been tested by the tests we have in school today, he realized that he could use that to his advantage. And I'm sure that he did. And when he went east to take the presidency, people in the East looked at him as not polished, awkward, not smart. And it was easy for his rivals to do that same thing, to look at him and say, oh, he's going to be a pushover. We can run the cabinet. We can take care of this. We can take care of that. We can have our way, not his. And so what did he do in response? He knew what was happening. That's how smart he was. He knew what the East was like. He knew what politics was like because he'd been in it for so long. He took the very men who were his greatest rivals, who wanted the presidency in some cases as badly as he did, and he put them in his cabinet, not just because of that, but because they were good at what they did. Chase was the ultimate good banker. He knew what money was all about. He wanted to be president. Lincoln put that man right in his cabinet. Seward had run on the Republican ticket against Lincoln. He put Seward right in his cabinet. And at the beginning, should I continue or? Get yourself a drink of water.
We'll wait for the door to shut. You clicked last time. She captured all of our attention. We weren't even paying attention to her coughing, I think. When you get finished talking with them about what we're doing, could you lead into the direction too of, were there any cabinet members, maybe you're going to talk about that, were there any cabinet members that were unconvinced or about the emancipation, or any that were convinced too, that he convinced them to do it?
Okay, we're ready.
I forgot where I was. He put those men right in the cabinet, and he knew that they would be good in the jobs he placed them in. One was, of course, Secretary of War Stanton. Cameron was the first Secretary of War under Lincoln, but Lincoln didn't want Cameron in the first place, period. It had been something that happened at the convention in Chicago, and he had said to his men, and he was not there, that was the way the conventions worked, said to his men, do not make any deals for me. Do not place me in a position where I have to honor something I don't want and won't believe in. And Cameron was that. So then he felt honor bound to take Cameron, even though he really didn't want him. And eventually, of course, when it was time to replace Cameron, thank you very much, Lincoln was probably saying to himself, he chose Stanton. And Stanton was a lawyer that Lincoln had come up against and had been actually in Ohio to help during the McCormick Reaper case, because Lincoln knew the other side of the McCormick Reaper case. And when he went to Ohio, he was, of course, it was years before the presidency, years before all these things happened that placed these two men in very important positions later on. But Stanton was well known in Ohio, and Stanton was, the lawyer. He was going to take care of this case. Well, when this young upstart, basically is what it amounted to as far as he was concerned, came over from Illinois and had been told, you're to assist on this, basically Stanton snubbed Lincoln and literally kept him out of the courtroom and kept him away from the case. And Lincoln knew that, and you don't forget things like that, so he didn't forget that. But he knew how good Stanton was and what Stanton could do in the position of Secretary of War. So he brought these men into the cabinet. At one time, such a crisis was reached that he actually asked every single one of them for their resignations. So they had to write them out and turn them in. And then Lincoln basically, had them to a great extent. But he continued to work with these men, and bit by bit and little by little over time, they either came to understand him and know what he wanted and why he wanted it, or to, beyond that, respect him for the way that he dealt with them and what he knew and how he could manage it. And what he wanted was one nation. He wanted one nation. By the time the president died, Seward had come to love him, literally love and respect this man. And Seward at first had started out by making suggestions to Lincoln. Lincoln might say, well, what do you think of this? And he'd show him a paper or he'd show him a speech. And Seward would say, well, I think if we change this and we do this and so and such and such. And there's records of what changes Seward made, and then there's records of the changes Lincoln made, even based on Seward. He didn't ignore what Seward suggested. He found good in the suggestions, and he found, very, very good ideas. But what he did was he made it even better. He made it even more concise. And then he went on to use it. And Seward began to respect Lincoln for Lincoln's understanding of what Seward was suggesting. And over time, they became very close. Lincoln would often take Seward on his carriage rides out to the soldiers' home or in different places around the city where the two of them could be separate from the rest of the cabinet and discuss matters of great importance. And where Stanton was concerned, Stanton came to apparently not only respect Lincoln, but also love him too. I don't know that he showed it in the same way, because Stanton was more of a blustery type of person. And so many things he would not necessarily express, but it was there. And then with Chase wanted the presidency, no matter what and no matter when, and made several attempts. And Chase had a daughter who was his hostess. Mrs. Chase had died early on, and so his daughter was young, she was beautiful, she was the opposite, she was basically Mary Lincoln's opposition in the social life of Washington, D.C. And if Kate Chase said, well, I think I'd like to order a dozen of those kid gloves, if Mary Lincoln heard about it, she'd probably order more than a dozen of those, maybe 2 dozen or 3 or 5 or 10 dozen, because she wanted to say, you're not the First Lady. I'm the First Lady. I'm in charge here in the White House, and I'm in charge of Washington society. And Mary had been rebuffed by the ladies of Washington, D.C. So there's this rivalry that's going on, not just amongst the cabinet members, but the cabinet members and their family, as opposed to Lincoln and his family. And Lincoln knows this. He can see it, he can hear it, he can understand. And as his family becomes more fragmented after Willie's death, and Mary is more and more in the White House and out a little less, he goes to a lot of these social events. He goes to Kate Chase's wedding. He goes here and there and everywhere. And he knows what's going on, and he knows what the rivalry is. And unfortunately, Chase is such a, he wants the presidency so badly that I think eventually Lincoln does basically let him out of the cabinet to get that tension away. But if Kate Chase had had her way, her father would have been president. As it was, her father entered into, how can I put it, little deals here and there that he should never have entered into. And Kate Chase's husband was guilty of treason and never tried for it. And Chase knew it. So there you go. Those are things that are happening right under Lincoln's eye. And did they come around to his thinking? I think many eventually did. Because Lincoln didn't do that. Just, everyone says, oh, you know, of course, if you release all the slaves in the Southern Territory, you know, they're going to come to the northern side and they're going to fight for the Union. But he didn't do it for that. He was convinced by the time he did it that it was the morally correct thing to do. Yes, it had other advantages, but you couldn't swear that all those advantages were actually going to take place. And his team of rivals saw who he was and what he was, and by the time he died, they were devastated. And even Seward, who was attacked the same night as the president died, was not told that the president had been killed, because his family knew what a toll that would take on him in his condition after having been attacked, and because he'd already been ill to start with. So they didn't tell him the president had died. And when the funeral cortege went by the window, he could hear the noise. He could hear the drumming. He could hear the hoofbeats. He knew what it was. And he said, the president has died. And it was extremely hard for him because he loved Abraham Lincoln.
Nice girls. Did you have any other questions? Wow, you covered a lot of things for us, Judith. Very nice.
It's
all different things than Justin had talked about. Anything else from the year group? I think you did it, Judith.
or did I?
Good.